Dr. RAMI BLECKT, Journeys in the Search for the Meaning of Life, a story of those who have found it. Chapter 9, Treachery from Heaven. Those first weeks, the first month, were the hardest ones in Arthur's life. He couldn't even have imagined that it could be so bad. Things were bad for him in every way, especially physically. The doctors told him after another examination that maybe some organs had been damaged. He couldn't move, but if he did move or the cleaning lady accidentally hit the bed while cleaning, he felt an incredible pain in his back and stomach. To Arthur, his life was over, and yet it was just a mere month ago that he had felt his life was only just beginning. The doctors left him alone and came only a couple of times a week to examine him and would say, "You need to stay here for a few months and then we'll decide what to do with you." Arthur asked whether a specialist or a professor might be brought in. They only chuckled in reply, "No one ever comes here." By all counts, the doctors themselves didn't know what to do with him or what diagnosis to give. The X-rays showed that he had a severely displaced spinal column, but the appearance of blood in his urine and painful digestion likely indicated that some internal organs had suffered some trauma, though analysis didn't indicate anything too severe. Arthur asked Mikhalich to call his friend in Moscow. Mikhalich came by later to Arthur's room and gleefully told him the news he had gotten from his religious friend. Arthur had died, he was told, saving other people. Jesus has taken him up to be with him, and we all pray for him. Now he is in eternity with Jesus. Mikhalich continued to smile broadly and said, "If that's the way people talk about you, it's a good sign." The two boys had been saved and hadn't even caught a cold. They told others that some man who had rescued them from the boat had drowned, caught by some floating log. They didn't even find his body, but they hadn't really searched too long. They had waited 10 days for his body to float ashore, but it never appeared. They were looking for his mother now to tell her what had happened. Mikhalich asked them not to trouble her and promised to speak with her himself and tell her everything. This news was like a knife twisting in him anew over his moral torment. "Everyone thinks that Christ has taken me home," Arthur considered. "Yes, he's taken me. He has sent me permanent torture since every day is like 10 years. Once again, for the 1000th time, he felt the question magnifying his pain and haunting him. Why? Now it was June and the weather out of the window was delightful. It bolstered his mood. He found himself thinking how he had become so attached to Mikhalich. If not for him, Arthur would have gone insane in this hospital with its dirty old wall tiles and him lying in his corner room, which hadn't been fixed up for ages. His talks with Mikhalich had helped him greatly. Their conversations had gotten more and more philosophical. One night, Mikhalich started their usual nightly conversation with a question. "Why do you consider yourself a believer?" Arthur gagged on the question. "Well, as I told you," he began, "I have spent the last few years studying how to serve God. I didn't even miss a service a Sunday. I would spend hours praying sometimes. I studied the Bible, know a lot of quotes from it by heart, and pardon the lack of humility, I participated in a lot of charitable actions." Mikhalich continued with a friendly smile. "But do you believe in God? See, it's interesting. I hear you being angry at God, that you don't agree that you have been taken to God's kingdom." "What kingdom?" Arthur cried out. Look around you. But isn't God's kingdom inside each of us, as Jesus himself said? Mihalich continued. Arthur stopped himself. Although he felt that behind Mihalich's good-natured dig there was something there, that it all had some sound basis, still he wasn't sure what it was. That was starting to annoy him. Yes, I'm angry at God. Satan has taken me, and he has permitted this all to happen, and now here I am. And that's why it's hard for me to pray to Jesus. Arthur voiced his objection. Arthur, wait a minute. Are you saying that Satan is on a par with God and that they're always doing battle? Is that what you're really saying? Mihalich asked. Arthur thought to himself for a moment. Do I really believe that Satan and God are equals? That would be a strange God who always had to slug it out with Satan. Arthur caught himself at that and confessed. Yes, of course, truly, all is God, and God is the source of all. Many saints and holy people say that God is everywhere. Can you really believe that something could happen here on earth without God's knowledge? Mihalich asked. Arthur agreed, citing a quote. It's true. Not a blade of grass shall stir without God knowing of it. So, should we not thank the Lord for everything? Mihalich asked. Arthur's rage boiled over again. What should I thank him for? I'm a cripple now, an invalid for my whole life. But there's some reason to that. You sacrificed yourself, but at least you saved some people. Maybe God wanted this to happen with some sort of purpose in your situation. Some spiteful God. Why didn't he save me? Exclaimed Arthur. Why spiteful? You have some primitive pagan idea of what God is, Mihalich replied. Arthur winced at that. Now he was being called pagan. In his religion, that had to be the lowest blow. It was the one thing that differentiated Christians from other religions. What kind of pagan do you take me for? I don't worship any idols, Arthur protested. That's not the defining factor. Consider, if you believe in God, you should see him in everything, in every atom. After all, nothing may happen without God's awareness of it. We have been brought here to this earth to develop ourselves, and developing ourselves in a real way consists of increasing our love of God. Is that not what the first commandment of the New Testament tells us? Love God with all your heart and all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. Since God has let this happen for some reason, it must be for the best. What happened to you also has a heavenly purpose, and it too is for the best. We just have to understand what that means for the best. If you consider yourself a transitory body, then the best would be when you live in comfort and are prosperous and successful. And bad would be sickness, enemies, failures, all of which would supposedly be from the devil. Then you would only come to the church to ask God for health, prosperity, and protection from the devil and his failures, suffering and misery. And that would be a paganistic perception in essence, regardless of whether you worship idols of God or not. Arthur remembered to his shame that as a pastor, he even taught and encouraged parishioners to ask that God grant them various benefits and comforts in this world. It's not hard to see that the first disciples of Christ, as holy and truly progressive individuals, did not turn to the Lord with such requests. Quite the opposite, They often chose the more difficult path, but always thanked and served him. Why? Because they were living on a spiritual level. They knew that they were souls, and their essential, eternal value was one of godly, unconditional love. That everything in this world is transitory: money, glory, philosophic and religious doctrines, ideals. It follows that you should not get attached to anything, since any attachment and dependency is a source of suffering, because it cuts you off from love and fills you with fear and greed. They saw only one reason for this heavenly drama, or comedy, depending on how you look at it: that our lives should help us become closer to God, which is in essence love. Therefore, they always tried to be givers, not takers, unlike those at the corporal level. They served everyone and loved everyone since they saw God in everyone and everything. They were always grateful, as opposed to the corporeal or users, who as a rule only put on pretenses, and if they visited a church, it would be to ask in their prayers for health and success. Satan, though, is not some terrible devil that takes away our material well being, but rather our own personified ego. And the more that grows, the more it brings fear, greed, self interest, dependence, aggression, anger, and other negative character traits into a person's life. They make a person unhappy and sick. You mean like me? Arthur asked sarcastically. Pretty much, yes. Do you really not know that everything that happens around us is a reflection of our inner world? Believe me, if you live with the harmonic worldview, you will be happy wherever you are. Virtually all illnesses and accidents begin with thoughts out of harmony. You mean I can be cured and happy? Come on, Mihalij, Arthur objected. On faith will it be rendered to you. Are not these words of Paul the Apostle the most often preached words in your church? Mihalij retorted. So, in other words, I am a disbelieving egotist who deserves this hellish life? And after all I have done, Arthur let out disappointedly. He was hurting so much that he was ready to burst out crying. Do you consider yourself great and righteous, an angel in the flesh? Mihalij asked. Is that not hubris speaking, my friend? It was like he had had cold water splashed on him. He had half a mind to throw something at Mihalij, but a quiet voice inside him said, He is wise, you know he is right. Arthur remembered how distasteful it had been to meet with two pastors in the US, one of whom had been born in Moscow. Although they spoke so beautifully, they did everything with an air of theatricality. They organized huge charity projects and they reeked of exclusivity and extraordinariness. On the other hand, some believers from the Moscow region who had served time in Soviet jails for their beliefs never strived to achieve high posts in the church. They performed a great deal of public works, such as construction and cleaning, and if people started praising them, they humbly walked away. Arthur especially remembered his uncle Savelli, who had done 12 years' time in the Far East for his beliefs. When he was released, however, he asked for nothing and would even serve when he was sick. In fact, he didn't shun any filthy work, although he had a college degree. He inspired Arthur more than these preachers with their beautiful sounding speeches. If he gave advice, his words went straight to the heart. He remembered one day they had carried some groceries to a charity cafeteria, and Arthur had been extremely disconcerted that not all the helpers had come. They hadn't known there was going to be so much work. Savelli very simply said, just do the work for Jesus and no one else, and do it with all your heart or not at all. Because the good you do is first and foremost for yourself. Read a prayer or remember words of the scripture rather than fuming with resentment. Arthur put himself in his place. Savelli wouldn't be acting as Arthur was now. Of course not. Rather, Arthur saw himself behaving more like those rich, pretty talkers. Realizing that, he felt the lowness of his current behavior. Seeing that Arthur was deeply troubled and thinking everything over, Mihalij gave him a good natured slap on the shoulder and got ready to go. So I can get better if I change? Arthur spoke out suddenly. It's possible. I have seen many cases, worse than yours, get better, in fact, in this very hospital. But getting cured shouldn't be your main concern, Mihalij replied. What should be my main concern? Reaching an understanding of unconditional love. That is the main thing for any truly spiritual, faithful person, Mihalij told him with a smile.